This is a work session of the Portland City
Recording in progress.
It's a work session of the Portland City Councils. Today's date is March 14th, 2022. This is
Recording in progress.
Facilitate the work session today on tax increment financing, returning resources. And I'm proud to present alongside our City Budget Office Leadership Director Jessica Kennard and City Economist Peter Holzman and our Chief Financial Officer Michelle Kirby. We are presenting today because of a budget note in the 2021-22 budget that directed the City Economist and the debt management team to provide an updated forecast of all anticipated available returning tax increment financing revenues, and for myself and Director Kennard to lead a work session to discuss potential investment options for these resources. So here we are today. We will talk about both the opportunities and the challenges presented by these expiring resources in the urban renewal area districts over the next 10 years. I want to answer an obvious question that came up from staff members that joined me in the Portland building today and asked this question: how does this fit in with the other budget sessions, since this is about future revenues? So I told them first that they should tune in and watch, but more importantly and more relevant, it's important for your current budget work as our city council, as you have the opportunity to think ahead. And we all know that it's going to get more challenging based on forecasted revenues, and to start planning ahead for the number of years coming ahead in budget, and to think about the impact that could have on your decisions in this budget season. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Our goals. Here's what we were hoping to accomplish today with you. We're going to start by regrounding all of us in what expiring tax increment financing districts mean for the city. We'll lay out some possible uses for these resources. We'll provide a high-level framework for how council could plan if council chooses to use these resources. And we hope that it informs some clear next steps for the organization. It will take a lot of planning on implementation for any strategy that council chooses. We are not planning to propose a specific allocation today. We want to hear from you. We have ideas, but we want to hear more clearly from you, your priorities and what you want us to do. And we talked individually to each of you about the fact that there are many paths that we could choose here. Also want to note, we are not talking about future models of key programs that you will hear about today. That includes economic development through Prosper Portland and housing service through the Housing Bureau. We're not asking you to weigh in on those particular service models and their future. Next slide, please. What do we need from you? So I've been in enough of these sessions to know that it helps with all of the incoming information and demands on your time to be as clear as possible in a work session about what will be most helpful to get back from council. Again, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, we do want confirmation of your interest to plan ahead and at what level you want to plan ahead. And we'll get to that towards the end of the presentation. We also want to hear more clearly what we believe we've heard from you individually or in other sessions. We don't want to make assumptions about what you want to prioritize. And of course, we'll get you any additional information that you need from this session. There's a lot of complexity to it. Next slide, please. Our agenda today. So we do try to learn from the multiple sessions that you go through. We're watching carefully. We think this will come in at just about 2 hours. So you will notice, I'm sure right away, we do not have a break built in. I will check in if I think we are in need of a break. And of course, that's not a negative thing to need. We just may need a break. But right now, we are planning 2 question and answer segments, as you can see on this agenda. I will facilitate those. I will also check in with you to see if we need some time away from the computer to come back. But first, I'll hand it over to Director Kennard and our City Economist, Peter, to talk through the financial implications of TIF. Please go back to that slide for just 1 sec, please. I'm sorry. I wanted to go through that really quickly. And then at the end, I want to say again, we will come to a decision-making framework and we will propose next steps. Any questions on the agenda before we go? Yeah, Commissioner Hardesty.
Excuse me, Director Reinhardt. I wanted to pause for a moment because the Office of Equity and Human Rights normally did a statement at the beginning. And if folks aren't able to read chat, they haven't seen it. And so
my apologies. My apologies. I should have noted that. Asena, I didn't mean to breeze through that. Do you want to make an opening statement? Please.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Asena Jambuz Lawrence, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the acting director for the Office of Equity and Human Rights. Jeff Selby, our interim director, is out of the office. As we begin this work session, Director Selby asked that I share a couple of reminders. When introducing yourself, please share your pronouns if you are comfortable doing so, as it creates a safer and more inclusive environment. Also, presenters, as you guide us through your presentation, please describe any photos or graphics on your slides. That ensures that those who are blind or who have low vision can engage with your presentation in a more meaningful way. And thank you, Tom, and thank you, Commissioner Hardesty.
Hey, thanks, Commissioner Hardesty. I appreciate you checking me on that. And thank you, Asena. I use he, him pronouns, and now I'm going to pass it on to Director Kennard and City Economist Holzman.
Thank you, Tom. For the record, my name is Jessica Kennard. I am the city's budget director, and I use she, her pronouns. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview of tax increment finance revenues, and then I'll pass it over to our city economist, Peter Holzman, to walk through the forecasted returning TIF resources. So first, tax increment financing has been a way to finance development in specific geographic areas in Portland and elsewhere. Historically, this method has been used to finance urban renewal areas. When a tax increment financing district is created, a geographic area has its tax assessment values essentially frozen at its current level. Subsequent increases in tax assessment due to investment and development are then reinvested in that geographic area for specific purposes to assist with the development of that area. TIF districts have established and well-known end dates, as one of the primary goals of this district has been to develop an area and then return the growth in assessed value that's created to the benefit of all the tax receiving jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So the slide before you shows an image of a map of the city of Portland with several dark blue areas in the central to northern areas of the city and in the eastern areas of the city. The dark blue areas show the 10 current larger TIF districts within the city of Portland. These include Interstate Corridor, the River District, Oregon Convention Center, South Park Blocks, Downtown Waterfront, Central East Side, North Macadam, Airport Way, Gateway Regional Center, and the Lentz Town Center. Additionally, there are 6 smaller Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative districts that are not pictured on this slide. Next slide, please. How TIF resources are allocated within a given district is authorized by the council and can vary. In 2006, council passed the TIF set-aside resolution establishing a desire to have at least 30% of TIF resources be set aside for affordable housing, for which an implementation plan was subsequently developed and implemented. Then, the minimum set aside for affordable housing was increased by the council to 45% in 2015. Between 2017 and 2021, thus, 45% of all TIF resources were allocated to affordable housing, which includes affordable housing production and home ownership programs, and 55% were allocated to economic development functions, primarily equitable development and small business leasing. More information on these services will be provided later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So this chart shows how resources are pooled by several jurisdictions to fund TIF districts. All property tax receiving jurisdictions forego general fund discretionary revenue in order to finance TIF districts. For most of the current districts, this means general fund resources are foregone by schools, Multnomah County, the city, and a few other taxing jurisdictions. Because TIF district revenues in Portland support city-run functions of housing and economic development, this means that TIF districts result in a net increase in funding for city services as resources are pooled from several jurisdictions to fund housing and economic development. The trade-off of this increased level of resource for the city is that we forego a lesser level of discretionary resource that could be spent on any service or in any area of the city. Prosper does note that while TIF resources must be spent within the TIF geographic district, these resources are allocated such that they allow organizations and programs to develop, which in turn does have benefits to programming citywide. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the converse of the prior slide and shows what happens to resources when TIF districts expire. Expiring TIF district resources return to the assessment rolls to the benefit of all property tax receiving jurisdictions. The example on this slide shows that for every dollar of expiring TIF resource in 24-25, the state school fund will receive 23 cents, Multnomah County will receive 21 cents, the city of Portland will receive 21 cents, and other jurisdictions such as the library and the port will receive a total of 12 cents. Funding will also return to taxpayers due to the fact that increased funding on the assessment rolls will result in a lower taxpayer burden for approved levies and GO bonds. I would highlight two key points from this slide. First, it is likely unfeasible for us to replace the lost TIF revenue as city services were previously receiving 100% of TIF and now will be receiving, in this example, 21% of the returning resource. Second, so that this dynamic, the fact that resources are pooled for these priority services, is important to consider when discussing the potential for new TIF districts. We're not going to address that topic today, but I just wanted to flag this dynamic as an important component for those future conversations. I'm now going to turn it over to City Economist Peter Holzman to walk through forecasted returning TIF resources.
Thank you, Director Kennard. For the record, my name is Peter Holzman. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the City Economist. Before I show forecasted amount of returning TIF revenue, I want to cover some caveats and limitations. First, the amount of assessed value returning from TIF districts is an estimate and may change. Second, the amount of returning general fund is based off of the returning assessed value and forecast of compression in delinquency and discount rates. Third, the forecast presented is for 10 years, and forecast uncertainty increases the further out you go. And finally, once TIF assessed value returns to tax rolls, there's nothing that distinguishes a TIF dollar from any other property tax dollar. So even after TIF resources return to the general fund, we will be relying on estimates of the amount of TIF revenue. This graph shows the amount of forecasted general fund revenue from returning TIF assessed value. Now, in the balanced 5-year forecast, some of the returning TIF revenue is needed to avoid budget cuts. This line shows the amount of TIF returning TIF revenue that can be pre-committed without taking cuts. Note that after fiscal year 28-29, the two lines are the same. This is because the 10-year forecast shows that TIF revenue will not be needed to have a balanced budget after fiscal year 28-29, in large part due to expiring debt obligations, predominantly pension obligation bonds. However, I should again emphasize that this forecast is outside the typical 5-year horizon and therefore highly uncertain. It is also worth reminding everyone that the amount of TIF revenue able to be pre-committed without cuts is likely to change both because estimates around returning assessed value, compression rates, and delinquency rates could change, and because the 5-year balance forecast will change. For example, while this does include the recent PPA and DCTU agreements, it does not include any future labor bargaining agreements. For the remainder of this conversation, I will focus primarily on the second line, TIF revenue able to be pre-committed without taking cuts. Again, this is the same line for TIF resources able to be pre-committed without taking cuts. Another way of reading this is the amount available to be pre-committed in each year. For example, in fiscal year 24-25, $19.5 million can be pre-committed without taking budget cuts, according to the current forecast. This blue area plot shows what this looks like over the span of a 10-year forecast. Note that it trends slightly upward. This is because the expenses associated with the funded programs will grow along with inflation, and we need to ensure that programs funded with TIF resources are sustainable over the span of the forecast. In fiscal year 26-27, an additional $4.5 million will be available. In fiscal year 27-28, $5.3 million will be available. In fiscal year 28-29, 9.6 million will be available. And finally, in fiscal year 31-32, 1.9 million will be available. The total amount of expenses for all funded programs in fiscal year 31-32 would be $47.5 million. This is the same information as the previous slide. TIF Resources able to be pre-committed without taking cuts in table form. Given the uncertainty in the out years of the forecast and to avoid restricting the flexibility of future councils, we recommend only pre-committing resources within the 5-year forecast. That would be the 2 years in bold, 19.5 million in fiscal year 24-25 and 4.5 million in 26-27. I'll now turn it back over to Director Reinhardt.
Thanks, Peter. Council, we have 10 minutes to take questions on this, knowing that we may have to come back to you with some questions after the work session, but there's a lot of complexity to tax increment financing, so please take the time you need here. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you. So my first question has to do with the excuse me. You said there's oh, I know what my question is. It's for Director Kennard. Director Kennard, last budget, we made some one-time investments that cover over a couple of, over the next 3 years, right? And one-time money we put into like 3-year studies and stuff like that in the fall bump. And so I'm wondering how that information will influence the conversation we're going to be having around the returning TIF dollars.
It's a great question, Commissioner. Thank you. That is actually one of the reasons why in the next section, we're going to talk about potential uses. And we've added a 5th section to potential uses that includes those types of commitments and needs. So we will talk about that in the next section a little bit.
Excellent. Thank you.
Other questions from this opening section? Wouldn't be the first time that we were wrong in terms of needing some Q&A time, but let me leave it just a few more seconds in case anyone has a question.
Tom, could you do me a favor? Sorry, Director Reinhardt, could you do me a favor and put up the slide that says what you're hoping to get from us today? I think I need that reminder right now.
Sure, Commissioner, we'll go back to that. And thank you for, I believe that's Ruth that's doing that, correct? Thanks, Ruth.
Okay, there it is.
Yeah. So Commissioner, to go a little bit deeper into 2, and I thought I was going to be more pressed for time than we apparently are in this first section. We have heard various things, not only from operational leadership in the bureaus, but also from council offices about how to potentially use this historic set of resources. So we want to get clear towards the end about what kind of budget note next step we should be proposing to you on scenarios so that it's useful for you and your colleagues as you discuss that. And we'll do more work on that at the end. That's what 2 is really about.
And if I could add to that, I also think that we have a couple of audits that we've authorized that should inform our thinking as we move forward. If someone could give us a timeline when the audits of both Prosper Portland's TIF activity, as well as a housing bureau, we have a study out to get some additional information. So I appreciate having this conversation early because I expect those audits to inform how we move forward.
Thank you, Commissioner. And as a reminder in the opening, yeah, we're just focused on the resource question today for a large city to understand what resources we may want to be putting forward in these various areas. Thanks for the reminder from staff, community budget advisors, council budget advisors, anything on this opening section. I know tax increment financing is not something that most of us think about every day. So if you have questions, please ask them. Okay, we will make up some time here, and I'm sure we'll be using it later for for question and answer and discussion later in the agenda. I'm handing it back over to Director Kennard, I believe.
That is right. So we are now transitioning to talk about the potential uses of returning TIF resources, and I'll be joined by CFO Michelle Kirby and again, Tom Reinhardt to walk through these different uses. Next slide, please. So this is not an exhaustive list of potential uses. Indeed, returning resources are discretionary and they can be entirely allocated at the council's discretion. These 5 areas are highlighted because they reflect key council priority areas, and they also reflect significant near-term financial needs or commitments that in some cases are directly tied to this resource. 2 of these service areas, affordable housing and economic recovery and development, are significantly impacted by the expiration of TIF districts, and the bureaus in charge of those services currently need to make near-term operational decisions to adjust a declining resource in the absence of a commitment of returning resource or another funding source. Build Portland, which is a feature of resilient infrastructure, highlighted second on this slide, is a council-approved initiative that held the initial goal of raising $600 million to fund the city's major maintenance needs by leveraging returning TIF resources over several decades. The first item, major city liabilities, and the last item, additional city council priorities, are both discussed due to the potential near-term financial needs to which TIF resources could provide a potential solution. We will discuss each one of these investment areas briefly in the slides to come. Next slide, please. Before we begin talking about each of these financial needs and potential uses of returning resource, I want to acknowledge that each of these investment areas represent large and in many cases complex needs. Returning TIF resource, while sizable, cannot absolve all of the financial needs that will be discussed today. To avoid focusing on a zero-sum game where one service is pitted against another for this resource, we want to highlight the need and the potential to develop multi-pronged funding strategies to address many of the needs discussed today. Additional funding strategies will be briefly highlighted following the overview of the 5 potential investment areas to come. Next slide, please. So the first potential areas of investment that we're highlighting for you today relate to major city liabilities. In 2019, the mayor directed the CFO, the budget director, and the city attorney to identify and propose solutions to major financial risks and liabilities facing the city. The 3 directors presented our findings, which included the identification of 7 major liabilities facing the city. We presented these to the council in March of 2020, just days before the onset of the state of emergency due to the pandemic. Since that time, we've deployed strategies to begin mitigating the costs and the risks to 3 of the 7 identified issues, highlighted with green shading. This is good progress, especially during challenging financial times. However, in part due to the financial environment of the past 2 years, the progress taken to date has been on relatively smaller liabilities. I want to draw your attention to the 3 issues on this list that you will note have a red dot in the first column. This column designates the estimated dollar impact of the liability, and the red dot in the column signifies an estimated cost of the liability in excess of $30 million. These types of large liabilities will likely require multi-pronged funding and policy efforts to address. The ones we will talk about today are those that are most urgent to address, which is designated by the red dot in the second column of this chart. Build Portland is one strategy to support the city's major maintenance and infrastructure backlog, which will be talked about second in our agenda today. But first, we're going to talk about the Portland Harbor Cleanup Project. Next slide, please. In 2001, the EPA formally notified the city that it is a potentially liable party for the Portland Harbor Superfund site. City is potentially liable under a federal statute that imposes strict liability on parties, which means that the city must participate in the cleanup of Portland Harbor. Since EPA notified the city of its potential liability, the city has entered several orders with EPA to fund interim investigation and planning work that's needed before cleanup of the river can begin. Portland Harbor is one of the most complex Superfund sites in the country, so not surprisingly, the cleanup will have high costs. As the planning phase progresses for what the cleanup of the river will consist of, the costs are difficult to estimate. Even more difficult will be figuring out the city's share of these costs. Approximately 100 parties are participating in an out-of-court settlement process that will hopefully result in an agreement among potentially liable parties on how to divide up the cleanup costs. The extent and timing of the financial impact to the city for Portland Harbor cleanup still cannot be reasonably estimated. However, while the process progresses, the city must find a way to prepare internally to meet the challenges ahead so the city will be able to meaningfully engage in settlement discussions. Next slide, please. So although we don't know how much or when we will need the funding, it is possible that an optimal settlement could result in funding being needed within the next 2 years. So for the purposes of smoothing a potentially large cost, Director Kirby and I met with our attorneys working on this issue, and we're proposing an initial goal of identifying $100 million in one-time general fund discretionary resources over the next 9 years. This target is established as a means of hedging against the potential service level disruption that getting a large sudden bill would cause. The additional liability faced by the city could render the cost to the general fund greater or less than this target amount. However, we feel that establishing this target will set the city up to be in a positive position as we plan for the upcoming settlement conversations. This funding goal can be achieved via a combination of ongoing and one-time resource. The city could opt to allocate up to $7 million in ongoing returning TIF resources in order to debt finance $100 million to meet this target. However, in understanding that there are several competing demands for the resource, we're proposing instead that the city consider funding this liability through a combination of ongoing returning TIF resources and annual general fund one-time ending balance. The proposal you see on the slide is to allocate between $3 and $4 million in ongoing returning TIF resources, which is supplemented by $3 to $4 million in one-time annual ending balance. These amounts are flexible. Ongoing resources could be increased in order to decrease the requirement of ending balance contributions and vice versa. The ongoing returning TIF resources are especially important to this plan because they provide us with the flexibility to generate a large amount of resource via debt financing if needed to make a large payment in a short amount of time. This flexibility can help our attorneys ensure that they can seek the most optimal terms of settlement. Next slide, please. So this slide shows how this proposed funding strategy would relate to the overall forecasted returning TIF resources previously described by City Economist Peter Holzman. As a reminder, the yellow line represents the forecasted returning TIF resources, and the blue line below represents the amount of resources that the economist has forecast as available to set aside or pre-commit without requiring the city to take cuts. The green dotted line represents the proposed funding from this resource for Portland Harbor liability. As mentioned in the previous slide, this ongoing allocation would enable debt financing flexibility and be an important component of reaching an overall target of $100 million over the next several years. I will now turn it over to Chief Financial Officer Michelle Kirby to provide an overview of Build Portland.
Thank you, Director Kennard. For the record, my name is Michelle Kirby, and I'm the city's Chief Financial Officer. I use she, her pronouns. And you heard last week at the work session on building a resilient infrastructure that the city faces a large funding gap for asset maintenance, and without a substantial investment of resources to address this issue, the city risks higher costs and lower levels of service in the future. Past progress in identifying resources, such as the Parks Bond, the Capital Set-Aside Program, and the gas tax revenue, were not enough. And in 2017, returning tax increment financing, or TIF, resources became part of the solution discussed with the formation of Build Portland. Build Portland established a program focused on funding major maintenance and repairs to the roads, bridges, parks, and buildings that the community uses every day. It is intended to close the funding gap and reduce intergenerational equity impacts over the next 20 years. In 2018, City Council passed a resolution with a stated goal of investing a total of $600 million in Build Portland by 2040. 7 phase 1 projects for a total of $50 million were selected, and the projects were initiated, and general fund debt was authorized for financing those project costs. The overall financial plan for Build Portland includes a planned phase 2 investment of $100 million in fiscal year 24-25 that was contemplated to be funded with returning TIF revenues. The city's debt manager estimates that we would need to allocate $7 to $8 million per year beginning in fiscal year 24-25 to finance the $100 million phase 2 investment in Build Portland. The next slide, please. Here you can see the list of the 7 Phase 1 projects for Build Portland. They were both in Peabot and Parks areas. There are 5 location-specific projects located throughout the city that you can see on the map, and then 2 were citywide projects that spanned across the city. One important item to note is that for these Phase 1 projects, Build Portland Resources represented on average 58% of the funding for the projects. This highlights that returning TIF resources will not be the entire solution to any of the needs that we're presenting today. The next slide, please. This slide shows different types of capital needs the city faces. As you also heard in last week's work session on building resilient infrastructure, access to funding is challenging across all asset categories based on the type of funds, the fund requirements, and the number of assets in need of maintenance and repair. The general fund has an important role to play in solving these capital needs, but you can see that there are other opportunities to leverage other resources as well. And of note, the resource solutions made to date, such as the capital set aside, are specific to parks, transportation, and emergency preparedness projects. Also recall from the slide on Building Portland Phase 1, no civic projects were included. As such, our civic assets are most frequently not prioritized for the limited funding allocated to major maintenance. Future funding approaches should consider being more robust to either address full project funding needs or support a broader number of projects across multiple bureaus. Next slide, please. So what would $100 million for Build Portland Phase 2 be used to fund? Of course, Build Portland would go through a selection and allocation process as part of Phase 2, but we want to show you today some concrete examples of the kind of progress that could be made with this level of one-time investment. At the top left, replacing the Kirby Garage facility is estimated to have a total cost of $120 million. So $100 million would pay for 83% of this project. The middle left, the Fire and Rescue Training and Logistics Center, could cost roughly $145 million, meaning that $100 million would pay for almost 70% of the cost. Continuing down, $100 million could fund the preservation of 17,000 miles of street lanes throughout the city, or going to the top right, complete 60 to 100% of Parks ADA transition plan to remove accessibility barriers across the facilities in the remaining years of their 20-year plan. And Peabot highlighted last week that $100 million could fund 10 to 15 of the 135 bridge replacements needed in their portfolio. And at the bottom right, 67 of the 59,000 plus traffic signals throughout the city that require a regular cycle replacement. Please keep in mind these are rough estimates, and they're only intended to be examples. And of course, if you funded less of one, you could buy more of another. While the city's total capital funding gap may be large, $100 million would mean significant progress on some of the highest priority capital projects. The next slide, please. I mentioned previously that in order to raise $100 million in fiscal year 24-25, the city would need to allocate an ongoing amount of $7 to $8 million a year for 20 years. And this graph shows what it would take to finance the original Portland building plan of raising $100 million in fiscal year 24-25 and $150 million every 5 years thereafter until 2040 to get to the overall goal of $600 million. And the Portland building plan is represented by the dotted green line at the bottom. And I will now turn it over to Chief Administrative Officer Tom Reinhardt.
Excuse me, could I get you to repeat that last series of numbers, Director? You said 8 to 10 million a year. Did I get that right?
$7 to $8 million a year
All right.
is needed to finance the phase 2 $100 million. And then, so that's the first, the green line kind of slopes up at fiscal year 24-25. Thank you for pointing out, and then goes across, where we then get to the need to add 150 million every 5 years to get to the overall goal in 2040.
Thank you for that. So can I, Director Kennard mentioned 4 to 5 million ongoing to address the super fund cleanup. Are you saying that this would be an additional 7 to 8 million? So if in fact the council went this route, that would be on top of?
Yeah, this is exclusively for the Build Portland capital projects.
Just wanted to make sure that was just wanted to make sure that was clear. Thank you.
Jessica,
and each example was only one thing of all the things that we need.
There's standalone examples.
Yes.
Let's go to Director Kennard and then Commissioner Ryan. I know the mayor has a question as well. Go ahead, Director Kennard.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I should have said this when I first showed you the first slide with the green dots.
Right.
We are going to show you what each proposal looks like individually as we talk about each of these individual proposals. And at the end, we'll show you a combined slide.
Thank you.
And Commissioner, before I go to Commissioner Ryan, Commissioner Hurst, I want you to be clear. We're trying to give you examples.
No, I'm loving this. I'm loving this. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what I'm being presented, just to be clear. Thank
Council has a lot of options here. We're trying to be clear. Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you. Perhaps I'm the only one that's getting lost in the number soup here. But when I first began listening, I was caught by the 600 million goal by 2040. That was said, right? So just simple math, that's 22 years. So it'd be an average of what, like 27 million plus a year. And so then I started hearing other numbers that were subsets that made that seem mathematically impossible if I'm being too linear. So I was going to try to wait until the questions, but since we started these Q&As about numbers.
Yeah, we're ahead of time. So let's get into that. Director Kirby or Director Kennard, do you want to answer the 3 phases of Build Portland?
Yes.
And tell me they'll still total the 600 million that was presented at the beginning.
Right.
I just don't want to be a part of another goal setting process where we're supposed to magically come up with the majority of it in the last 2 years of the goal. That's all.
Right. The overall plan back in 2018 was for phase 1 of $50 million, phase 2, $100 million, and then $150 million every 5 years, starting in 2030 to reach, so that adds 450. And so then you get to a total of 600, 50, 150, and 3 times 150.
And Commissioner, I would just add that the distinction here is between what you're looking at on the chart in the green line is an ongoing allocation that is going to be used, ongoing funding is going to be used to pay debt service to deliver the large amount of one-time funding streams. So we're talking about $600 million of one-time is going to be facilitated through different tranches of debt financing over several years. And that's similar to the strategy that I shared with you related to Portland Harbor. $100 million will be financed in part by debt financing. And that's why the ongoing allocation supports the debt financing costs.
That was helpful. One more clarifying question then. At the beginning, you made it really clear that this council, before most of us were here, I believe, did a goal of 45% affordable housing and 55% economic development. And so everything you're talking about falls into those two categories, including the cleaning of the harbor.
So that was a goal that
I realize
council
I said something that probably wasn't right, but I'm just saying that it's hard to follow based on what was presented earlier.
Yeah. So we're kind of addressing two worlds simultaneously. We're talking about the world of TIF districts, and the world of TIF districts is where we started. Is we have funding that was sort of sequestered in these geographic areas in TIF districts, and that those funds, council said that 45% of those funds in those districts have to be spent on affordable housing initiatives. But we're approaching a time when those districts are sunsetting. And so the world after the TIF district is that those resources return to the general fund, and council has discretion around how they want to spend those resources. And so those are the 5 areas. We're discussing 5 areas, and the council can spend those resources on anything that they would like.
Okay, so the world's our oyster. It doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of the previous vision, which is around economic development and affordable housing. It means that you're presenting us with more options.
Correct.
That's
And I
right.
will get into that in the next section, Commissioner.
Okay. I hope I didn't bore anyone with such a question.
Good
Thank you.
question. Mayor, do you want to ask your question now?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So could somebody tell me phase 2, what percentage of the TIF Boomerang Funds is that? I don't have a sense of what the trade-offs here if I don't understand what percentage we're talking about.
So the question is how much of the debt financing per year, what percentage that is of the returning revenues?
Correct.
Yeah.
We can get you exact numbers, but from an eyeball estimate, it looks like about 25% to me.
25%. Okay.
Yeah.
And I would like it to be a little more precise if you could get that to me later.
Yep.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You will.
I one quick question before we move on. Was there a council vote? Who decided that phase 2 would be $100 million and this was the path we were taking? Was this a council vote, or where did this happen?
So for Bill Portland, Commissioner?
Yes, for Bill Portland, yes.
Yeah, so the council passed a resolution that established a goal,
Okay.
but did not commit council to anything beyond the first tranche of $50 million. But it did discuss a goal of raising $600 million by 2040.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's what I remember too. I remember that there was no commitment to anything other than phase 1. So I'm just kind of curious where phase 2 popped up.
Yeah, so I'll answer that, Commissioner Hardesty. So the goal was a long-term goal, but we all understood that we could not find future city councils around capital infrastructure, particularly given that it would not be bonded until later years. So there's no way we can tell the city council that they have to reserve funds for bonding in future years. But Bill Portland was something that I championed at the advice of many in the city who did not see any other way for us to get at the deferred capital maintenance backlog, which seems to dog us eternally. So the reason I just asked what percentage of the returning boomerang funds this is I want to get some sense of what the choices and the trade-offs are. And you are correct that the first $50 million tranche was really the trial balloon for this. For those of you who are newer to the council, I will tell you that all of those projects were picked with great intentionality. They were different kinds of projects in different parts of the city. They were all projects that were highly, highly sought after over a period of many, many years, but we just never could seem to find the funding to support those projects. And the initial tranche was very well received by the public. And so it'd be my personal hope that we do reserve funds going forward for Bill Portland. I think it was a well-conceived proposal. It was the only way we could think of that would not raise taxes and would chip away at the deferred capital maintenance backlog, as well as giving us some opportunities to free up capital for new projects. So that was sort of the genesis.
Thanks, Mayor. So Director Kennard, over to you to close.
So I think that's a great discussion. I'm glad we got into a little bit of the details of this chart because you're going to see it again a couple of times. So if there aren't any other questions, I think it actually goes back to you, CAO Reinhardt.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to, Commissioner Maps, do you want to ask something before we go on? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, actually I do.
Go ahead.
Maybe I have, I want to make a statement and then I want to ask a couple of questions about the Portland Harbor piece. First, I already know that I'd like to see more about how we can direct some of these dollars towards our infrastructure needs, especially in parks and PBOT. So I hope that that's one of the outcomes of this discussion. And then I also know that I'd like to see some of these dollars set aside for the Portland Harbor, but in order to lay the groundwork for why I'm there, I'd like to get some stuff on the record. So I forget who did the presentation. Was Director Kennard, did you do the Portland Harbor presentation? First, 4 quick questions. Is the Portland Harbor a mandatory expense? Like, could future councils come together and decide we don't want to do this?
It will be a legal settlement, so we will be obligated to pay whatever the settlement is.
And I guess past councils have directed you to raise a certain amount of dollars in the next decade or so. Can you remind us how much that is? Or
I am going to turn it over. I'm going to see, I believe Annie Von Berg is on the call and is our resident Portland Harbor expert. And I'm wondering, Annie, if you happen to know those dollars offhand.
I don't know those dollars offhand. I can certainly get those. Those have been up to this point a project by project or a phase by phase approach in terms of council approval for those expenditures. We have set up internal accounts to help collect those funds, and I'm happy to provide all those numbers to you and the rest of your colleagues.
okay, and thank you for that clarification. And I'd love to see what the final number looks like, or at least our best guess as to the number looks like. And how much, can you remind us again how much you're proposing to set aside for the Portland Harbor?
Between $3 and $4 million. So I think the chart shows a $3.5 million annual allocation of returning TIF.
Okay, and that would allow us to leverage how much?
Approximately around a little less than $50 million in debt financing is our initial estimate. Of course, that can fluctuate with interest rates, et cetera. But that's roughly the estimate, and that would be supplemented by ending balance contributions that would get us the rest of the way to the $100 million.
Okay, thank you. And the point of those questions was to illustrate for folks who aren't following this project as closely as others. This is an inevitable expense. It's going to be a big expense. We don't know how large it's going to be. And the ability to invest $3 million so that we can leverage 50 sounds like a good deal to me, which is one of the other reasons why I hope that this particular project continues to receive some work from staff. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Sorry if I missed your hand raised.
Oh, no problem.
Okay, now we're going to turn to what has been mentioned a couple times earlier, and I know Commissioner Ryan mentioned it, affordable housing and economic development services funded by tax increment financing. Okay, so the impact of those services in terms of what the city has been doing over many, many years, there's a tremendous impact around the fact that what we refer to as as insiders to the TIF cliff, tax increment financing cliff, meaning these dollars are going away for these types of services that the city provides. We really need to get into that and explain that a little bit here. Before I begin, I want to reiterate, I'm focusing on the functions and the services and programs that these dollars provide, not on the specific bureaus that house the services or the way they're currently structured. We will return to this at the end because we do think the city as a whole, as an entire organization with council, should be talking about that sooner rather than later. While we have known for many years that this so-called cliff on tax increment financing is coming, it's also clear that these functions are critical in terms of what we have committed to provide to Portlanders and all of our partner agencies that help us provide these services. For quick context, I want to tell you some examples of what tax increment financing have enabled through these services in the city. I think it's beyond doubt that no matter what the different opinions are of tax increment financing and urban renewal, we would live in a fundamentally different city if these resources hadn't been allocated over the past couple of decades. The creation of public parks and recreational amenities through the city, more than 5,600 affordable homes in Northeast Portland, Lents, Gateway, Central City, stabilization of thousands of families through affordable rental homes and home ownership. Since 2000, more than $200 million of tax increment financing has supported the development of transportation systems and infrastructure. It's also supported hundreds of small businesses and more than 200 nonprofits with grants to address capital needs, improvements, and all sorts of issues. Next slide, please. But just wanted to provide some context on why we think this is important to reground council in. Tax increment financing, as you can see on this chart, and for those who are blind or have low vision, we have a series of bar graphs here. The blue in the bar graphs show how tax increment, the green in the bar graph shows tax increment financing slowly but then steadily dwindling on the chart. You can see that as it goes down, particularly by 24, 25. And even more so, the affordable housing bonds passed by voters have temporarily replaced some of the tax increment financing gap. But you can see that also dwindles. And for those who aren't able to view the chart, that's what happens as well between 21, 22, and 23 into 24. By fiscal year 25, 26, affordable housing resources, are expected to decline to their lowest levels since the Housing Bureau's creation in 2010. While there are other sources available, all projected sources of funds will not equal the amount that we will lose or that will be redirected, is probably a better way to put it, if choices aren't made to continue housing services. Next slide, please. This slide shows the business lines for the Housing Bureau and the current housing services it provides. Tax increment financing plays an important role in many of them, as you can see. So for those who can't see the chart or have low vision, there's a blue segment of each of the pie charts that shows the significant portion of tax increment financing from urban renewal areas that provide home ownership services, home ownership stabilization, asset preservation, and affordable housing production, as well as equity policy and data services. Next slide. Different but similar story for economic development. The city's economic development work has similarly been predominantly funded by tax increment financing, along with an annual allocation of general fund. Over the past 10 years, as council members know, in preparation for this declining resource, Prosper Portland has reduced staff by over half. And I should clarify for those listening who don't know, Prosper Portland is the city's economic development agency. And Prosper Portland has also pursued new revenue streams with an eye towards greater financial sustainability. But you can see on this chart, it's been a much different agency and team with half the staff that it used to have. This includes things like revamping and launching a small business loan program, which resulted in doubling loan production and investing in mission-aligning operating assets that generate additional revenue. With public health mandates, as we all know, small businesses were hit particularly hard, and Prosper offered loan flexibility and has done great work to his clients and commercial tenants across his portfolio. And apologies for my light, it keeps going off. As you can see here, though, the TIF Resources declining to really zero in 23-24. And you can see that from the yellow line, and for those who can't see the slide, operating expenses will exceed resources by 23-24, and then again in 25-26, 26-7. So we have a key question for the council about how it wants to continue to provide economic development services as a large city. Next slide, please. Similar to the slide I showed earlier around housing services, this shows the breakdown of revenues across the different lines of business that the city provides through Prosper Portland. As you can see from the slide, tax increment financing provides the lion's share of funding for key services that we, to date, have provided as city government through this partner agency. If you can't see the slide or you have low vision, access to capital, equitable development, and small business leasing and asset management would nearly completely have to be dwindled to nothing or reduced to zero funding without tax increment financing. Next slide, please. So the proposal that we have here and that we want to talk about is to set aside an amount. And so similar to what Director Kennard explained earlier, this is a separate idea for council to think about. And again, at the end, we will talk about which you want us to prioritize and how as we develop scenarios for you. But in short, in order to retain some basic functions of housing, affordable housing services and economic development services, the proposal is to use 50% of all returning TIF revenues. And that would equate to 16 million ongoing beginning in fiscal year 24-25 to ensure that we have the level of services that we have today. Now, of course, council can debate that and talk about that and also propose a different approach. But without this dedicated resource, what we're trying to make sure council understands and that would need to be planned for, both agencies and their respective staffs would need to be able to make plans. And we need some lead time regarding staff and business lines and engage with partners to communicate the different priorities or the impacts of a dramatic and drastic reduction of revenue beginning in fiscal year 23-24. And as I mentioned earlier, with larger reductions thereafter. Next slide, please. I'm going to let you read through the next two slides, and I'm not going to delve deeply into them orally, but you can see the impact of housing programs. For those that can't see the slide or have low vision, not replacing tax increment financing for housing programs would dramatically reduce affordable housing development, home ownership, and home ownership stabilization. And that's what the slide shows. Next slide, please. Again, a similar story and a similar slide that we constructed to show council and the public what would happen to economic development services without tax increment financing. Inclusive business development, for those that can't see the slide, small business support programs, access to capital, all of these would be significantly impacted. I'll give you a couple seconds to read through that. All right. Now I believe it's over to Director Kennard for council priorities.
Thank you, CAO Reinhardt.
Actually, can I ask some questions about housing and TIF?
Commissioner Maps, if you could wait just 5 minutes, we're going to be in a long.
Sure. All right. I can wait.
Okay.
All right. Well, so as our sort of fifth and final area we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to briefly talk about potential ongoing funding needs related to council's priorities, which have been identified and invested in over the past year. As discussed in earlier work sessions, the council has allocated historic amounts of resource in response to an historic need during the crises of the past 9 months. Many of the services supported are likely ongoing service needs, despite that they were funded with one-time resource. In fact, many budget requests that the council is considering in the sessions this month represent the continuation of services funded with one-time resource over the past year. We estimate that between 50 million to 70 million of ongoing resource could be needed or desired to continue support for the items that were funded with one-time resource over the past year. While financial policy advises against using one-time resources for ongoing needs, council can responsibly deploy one-time resources as a bridge to an ongoing resource that is anticipated to become available at a later time. As the council may be considering this strategy as part of their fiscal year 22-23 budget development decision-making, we wanted to be sure to highlight these recent investments and needs as part of this presentation. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a number of priority investments which have either received one-time resource in the past year and or have requested resources in the current budget process and have likely ongoing funding needs. It's worth noting that a few of these programs are actively pursuing alternative funding streams. However, the majority of these programs are either requesting general fund or do not yet have an established funding plan for the out years. It's also worth noting that there are funding gaps to support council adopted goals for equity and climate action. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the same line chart around returning TIF resources that you've now seen a number of times. The yellow line again shows the returning TIF resources, and the blue line below it shows the amount of TIF that can be pre-committed without having to take cuts elsewhere. In this slide, the dotted green line represents the combined proposed allocation of TIF resource to support the funding strategies you just heard for Portland Harbor, Build Portland, and affordable housing and economic development services. This green line does not include the potential costs of continuing any of the additional council priorities that I just discussed on the prior slide. And this is because those investments would render the green line off the chart, and also because the cost estimates for many of those items are still being developed. You'll notice in this slide that the green line is above the blue line between the current year and fiscal year 27-28. What this signifies is that in order to accept all of the proposed funding allocations for Portland Harbor, Build Portland, and economic development and affordable housing, the council would need to find additional resources via cuts to other services for these years. It is worth noting, however, the green line is still below the yellow line, which means that these requests fall below the amount of anticipated returning resource. This is important because it signifies that if the council of yesteryear had taken action to sequester these resources earlier, it would have been possible to fund all of these requests. Now, you should note that had council taken that action earlier, the trade-off would have been less resources or more cuts over the past couple of years to produce a balanced budget. And that is the trade-off that you would be looking to potentially in the future as well. Next slide, please. So it's clear that returning TIF resource cannot solve for all of our funding needs. As mentioned earlier, the investment areas discussed today, as well as other city needs, will require multiple funding strategies. Some ideas are listed on this slide. First, we've recently received significant increases in revenue for key priority areas and should ensure that we're taking advantage of those opportunities to maximize the impact in our priority areas. This includes, of course, the Parks Levy, the Clean Energy Fund, and Supporting Housing Services Measure, among others. Second, we should also continue to look at innovative new funding models. The Bureau of Transportation and the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability have been doing good work in this arena recently. Third, it's important to acknowledge that many of the problems we're trying to solve for are larger societal problems that we simply cannot fund our way out of on our own. We must continue our state and federal lobbying efforts to enable adequate and holistic funding and policy strategies to address our complex societal needs. The City of Portland has the highest possible credit rating due to our strong financial management practices and policies. However, there are opportunities for us to more comprehensively and strategically consider and deploy both our internal financing tools as well as our requests of voters for more funding. Finally, as our city evolves and changes, we should consider reallocating our internal prioritization of resources to meet our changing needs. And while it's not listed on the slide, I should also mention the need to stay focused on our core service areas, on those services that we are either mandated to provide or we are uniquely positioned to provide maximum public benefit around. As just one of several jurisdictions serving Portlanders, we simply cannot afford to, nor are meant to, solve all of the needs and challenges our communities face. With that, I will turn it back over to CAO Reinhardt.
Okay, I know Commissioner Mapps wants to get into questions right away. We have about 15 minutes, and I should have mentioned at the end of my last section, we do have leadership from the Housing Bureau and Prosper Portland in the meeting to answer questions as well. Thank you for being here. Commissioner Mapps, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Let's start with housing. As these TIF dollars expire, a lot of the funds that we have been using over the past several years to bring on more affordable housing will disappear. I wonder what other resources, are there other governments in the Portland metro area that are helping bring on affordable housing? Does anyone own this space?
Director Callahan.
Thank you, Commissioner Mapps, for the question. There are other regional resources, which include the Metro Housing Bond. Those resources are within our forecast that you saw. So the responsibility that we have for Portland's share are actually within our forecast, and we expect to have those expended by FY 2026. In terms of additional resources for affordable housing development, Portland has been a standout with its tax increment financing being dedicated, at least in part, to affordable housing development. And then local jurisdictions of a certain size have access to federal funds for development like home and community development block grant, which you also saw in our forecast. Did that answer your question, Commissioner?
It did, Director. Thank you. And as long as I still have the floor, maybe we can go over to Prosper. It was shocking to see what Prosper's financial future and even present looks like. I'm just trying to get my brain around what Prosper looks like and does without TIF dollars. What's Director Brandon? What do you see your mission being if these dollars go away?
Thanks for the question, Commissioner Mapps. I'll say a couple things. One is that we receive about $6.5 million a year in general fund resources. Those are really precious resources, and those support some of the most well-known economic development programs that we have. So the Inclusive Business Resource Network, which serves 1,000 businesses a year, the Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative District, our workforce development programs, and our traded sector work to support the retention and expansion of our city's employers. Those resources are basically cross-subsidized through TIF by almost an equal magnitude. And so that allows for us to make sure that the resources that Council has invested with us are predominantly able to go into community. Without TIF, therefore, we would see about half of the resources that we have being able to be deployed into community, and significantly fewer staff resources to get those programs out. So the Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative districts, for example, if there's no new TIF and we are really in a worst case scenario, we just won't have the staff capacity to support a program of that requires that level of staffing. So it's a very, very different bureau on the economic development side. Now, on the development side, 90+% of our resources are funded through, or of what we invest is funded through tax increment finance, and that leverages about a 7-to-1 public. We get about a 7-to-1 ratio with that in terms of private resources that are leveraged. But we would have some ongoing liabilities that we would need to maintain. So that includes ownership of Union Station. That includes the fact that we own the post office. That includes the fact that we have assets in Lentz. And so what we would really be doing is prioritizing those resources that we do have to maintain those assets and to make sure that we are able to modify loans and to sort of do the basic fiduciary responsibilities that we have and the legal responsibilities. So very different organization without tax increment finance.
Thank you for that clarification.
Commissioner Hardesty, and then I'm going to ask Commissioner Rubio if she has comments or questions.
Thank you. Before I forget, let me tell you just how greatly I appreciate both the format and the layout of this work session. And I know Director Reinhardt knows I've been asking this since I showed up in January of 2019 about the TIF cliff. And I have to say, I commend everyone involved in really doing really putting it together in a very digestible manner. So let me just be very appreciative now because I don't want to forget that. So I have a question for Prosper, Director Branham. How, now that the last federal administration created enterprise zones that allowed the state of Oregon to declare a whole bunch of downtown and a bunch of the city of Portland as a enterprise zone so that investors would pour their billions of dollars in to build a whole bunch of stuff. And so over the last couple of years where we've all been shut in, apparently those investors, that $4 billion has built a whole lot of places in the city of Portland that none of us can afford to lease or live in. What it would be different about Prosper as an economic development arm when all of us can see economic development happening everywhere, but it's just not benefiting Portlanders?
So Commissioner, so I think the Opportunity Zone program that the previous administration created definitely created tax incentives for investments in areas that our state business Oregon with the governor determined would be areas for priority investment. The unique thing about that program, unlike say the enterprise zone, which has job creation and tracking requirements, and that is managed through Prosper Portland and other economic development organizations, is that opportunity zones don't have any performance outcomes that are associated with them. So it's a very unusual program, and not something that I think I've certainly seen before. So I would contrast that to things like the enterprise zone, which City Council reauthorized and required the use of community benefit agreements, or in our own public-private partnerships where we are investing tax increment finance, where there is a requirement for, even if we don't put any money into it, if we sell land, there are requirements for green building codes. There are requirements for how we do our how construction equity happens. And so, we are very much thinking in each of our developments, how do we optimize community benefits while also making sure that we are aligning with our smart growth priorities and trying to help small businesses stay and prosper. So in terms of the overarching view of, what do the next 5 years look like, I'm really excited to be engaging with a number of community partners and hopefully some fantastic consultants from across the country who are going to help us think about what that looks like, and really think about over the next 6 months or so, bringing back and then coming back to City Council with that inclusive economic development strategy to identify what are some key interventions that could be made.
Thank you for that, Director Brenham. So what could it look like as you're investigating if we put all the land the city of Portland currently owns into a public land trust and then really restricting the development at 60% and below median family income for both residential and businesses? I am terrified that workers will no longer be able to live in the city of Portland, and small business owners who have 20 or less employees are being priced out all over the city of Portland. If we put every piece of land we own, rather than you selling it to a private developer and negotiating, what would it look like? Because then housing would also be able to really build housing people could afford to live in. Small business owners would know that this land would permanently be available for regular people. I am very terrified that if we continue the way we're going, you said 5 years, I say 2. Nobody who works in a hotel, restaurant, music venue, sports venue will be able to live in the city of Portland. And if we don't do something radically different, that's where we're going to be. So I hope with the consultants that we're really looking at, I have our attorneys looking at what a publicly owned land trust would look like. And I've been talking to community-based developers. And there's some real excitement about us, like really making sure that real people will be able to continue to live, work, and play in the city of Portland. I also had that's my question about economic development, and also applies to affordable housing as well. Because what you didn't say is really the breakdown, because what we've learned is people use the term affordable housing quite a bit in this venue. But what we know is that with the median family income at $96,900 for a family of 4, what we have traditionally thought of as affordable housing is no longer affordable for people who work in the city of Portland. So when we say affordable, what are we talking about today? And I guess I'll ask Director Callahan that question.
Commissioner Hardesty, thank you for the question. Everything that the city of Portland puts direct financing or funding in terms of rental housing is affordable at 60% area median income or less. We work very hard to make sure that there is a significant number of deeply affordable units for families that make below 30% or with little or no income. Every single project that we fund has some level of 30% units in it. We can increase that if we have voucher support or, for instance, rental support from the Supportive Housing Services measure. The only housing that the Housing Bureau works on that is at a higher income level is either homeownership housing and or housing that we provide an incentive to, meaning no direct cash is flowing from the city to that development. So I think the most predominant program that we have in that area would be the inclusionary housing program, which will work up to 80% of area median income because of the state law that requires that we have to have a program at 80%. And in that case, those developers do not receive any direct financing from the city. So they do not receive tax increment, they do not receive housing bonds, they do not receive any of our other federal funds. They do receive incentives at this point in tax exemptions and SDC exemptions if they meet 60% of area median income. If they're at 80%, they're eligible for a tax exemption.
Thanks, Director Callahan. Oh, Commissioner, I want to give a couple more people a chance here. I'll come back to you. Commissioner Mapps.
Didn't you start with Commissioner Mapps?
Oh,
yeah, you should do it. I have a question. It's very in the weeds. I will definitely give my colleagues a chance to go first.
Commissioner Rubio, I'm sorry. I said I was going to come over to you. Do you have anything to ask or to comment on?
Yes, I do.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to first appreciate the presentations. It was very thorough. There's a lot to digest. So I'm asking my question in that vein. First, I just want to say that for me, when I think of the city and the core functions and business of the city, I do feel in whatever scope or whatever shape that takes in, there should be an economic development, program. There should be a housing program. But my question is for both you, Kimberly and Shannon, is what would that difference be for community folks, for business owners, for developers? What does that end product look like on the ground? Should your program dramatically change? What are we going to get, and what are we not going to get, and how is that comparable to other cities on the West Coast of similar size or comprehensive makeup to Portland?
Director Branham, you want to go first?
Happy to. So thank you, Commissioner Rubio. So when you think about other cities across the West Coast, we're actually different in some ways because neither Washington or California now have tax increment finance as a tool anymore. And so we actually have an example in California where you used to have organizations that were funded through tax increment finance. And then now no longer are because urban renewal was discontinued. And so what we've seen in a number of those areas is the impact of what happens post-TIF, but also how do you fund the economic development functions? And so the city of San Francisco, for example, I believe, and San Diego also dedicated some portion of returning property taxes to maintain the capacity. And we did have an analysis at one point done by HRNA in terms of peer cities, but we will get that to you in terms of the exact apples comparison. But they have maintained those functions. And the tool that they tend to use is community development block grant dollars and other resources. And the resources that they have available for small businesses are smaller than what we have been able to put out. The same is true in the city of Seattle, where they have a robust team, actually formerly led by Bobby Lee, but where they have a lot of staff, but fewer programs than what we have been able to put forward because of the fact that we've been able to cross-subsidize with TIF. So I think at a really high level, we've had a robust small business focused economic development program that has supported thousands of businesses, both with technical assistance and with capital. Without this, we will have more businesses, particularly more small businesses, that are subject to displacement and relocation.
Great. Thanks, Director Brennan. Dr. Callahan, do you want to answer the housing component?
Yes, and thank you for the question, Commissioner Rubio. Different cities and states have different methods of financing. I think notably is Seattle in terms of housing. They have an ongoing housing development levy, which funds hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of units each year. Unlike our tax structure, which requires approval of the levy, I believe every 5 years. It is an ongoing levy, which does not have to be reapproved by the voters. And then in California, notably, they have a slightly different system of bonding authority than we do. And California also uses a series of housing bonds to fund at least affordable housing development. And I think the second part of your question is what's going to look different from this funding proposal. So right now, tax increment finance in this budget year supports $6.3 million in staffing and overhead. So it covers portions of our lease. It covers our agreements with, for instance, the city attorney's office, and it covers key staff like our equity policy staff, our directors' positions, and those who are working on development. The proposal that you have in front of you would start with about $8 million in funding from TIF for each agency. So it would cover the ability for us to maintain a level of a robust housing agency. Obviously, we'll contract slightly to meet our available resources, but we will not have to go from be cut in half in terms of staffing in 3 years. So there'll be a little bit of available funding above that. And I think the other thing to note is that you'll still be approving our budget each and every year and how we spend our resources. This essentially allows us to have a bridge to maintain a housing agency until we're able to secure additional resources, which I think are going to be needed to continue to preserve and develop affordable housing, whether that be an affordable housing bond or whether that be expansion of TIF districts. But what will not occur is a contraction of an agency to essentially a compliance agency, which is what our projections are in the next 3 years. So we would have to be moving our staffing resources to address our federal compliance as well as our ongoing asset management. We do have regulatory agreements over 15,500 units of affordable housing within the city of Portland, and we'd need to maintain our team to make sure that those units were continuing to be rent regulated into the future. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Just one quick clarification on question of clarification. So your contract, you would have to contract a little bit, you mentioned. So what are there other entities in the city that would provide or fill the gap? Or are we providing unique service and we would just be experiencing a significant critical gap?
Well, there is no other agency within the city that provides affordable housing development or preservation. There is no other agency in the city that provides critical home repairs to low-income seniors and those with a disability, like disability access ramps. There is no other agency at the city that provides down payment assistance loans or construction loans for, development loans for homeownership creation. And there's also, frankly, not the expertise in other bureaus or agencies with the city to meet those functions. So those are the key functions that TIF is paying for that we would start to contract.
Thank you.
So we've got one more question from Commissioner Hardesty, it looks like, and then I'm going to ask Council for the forbearance to do 10 more minutes of presentation, then we'd have the remainder of the time for discussion on next steps. Is that okay, or do we need to Commissioner Maps, could you hold your question, or do you need to do it in this section? I'm open either way. Just want to plan.
I need to do it in this section.
Okay, let's do Commissioner Hardesty and Commissioner Maps. And if Commissioner Ryan or Mayor Wheeler, you can tell me with your hand up if you need a question in this segment.
Mine can wait. I just hope Commissioner Hardesty, I hope the questions you've been putting in the chat are addressed right now too, because you've asked some questions in the chat.
Well, I'm just going to ask one or two right now because I know we're at a time limit and I know other people may have questions. I want to be respectful. That's why I put them in the chat. But this conversation, especially with Director Callahan, actually made me raise my hand again because I think we're asking the wrong question. In my mind, is the city the best people to provide affordable housing in the city of Portland? We have community-based development organizations that do a very effective job of actually providing wraparound services, all the supports, building and managing and servicing affordable housing, real affordable housing for folks in the city. The housing bond that we put on the ballot was the most expensive housing bond on the planet. And I would be very reluctant to just send something out because we need money. I want us to have a deeper conversation, which is why I asked about the land trust idea, right? It is important that we not just do things because we've always done it, but that we actually do a big picture vision about where we're headed. The same is also true for some of the economic development that we've done. And until we get reports back, the audit back from whether or not urban renewal, in my lifetime, urban renewal has always removed poor people and then moved in rich people. And what I've seen with my eyes is that we've done it no different than any other city has done urban renewal. And now we just call it tax incremental financing, but it still has the same outcomes. So again, it feels like, we're like, well, we got to protect and save. I don't want to protect and save. I want to actually build something different, something that truly benefits our community, both short-term and long-term. And I hope we create a space where we can have that conversation rather than being driven to make decisions based on whether people have to cut staff or not. I have a great deal of respect for both Prosper Portland and an incredible staff there, as well as for Director Shannon and incredible staff at the Housing Bureau. So hear me clearly. This is not about the individuals. This is about policy and whether or not we're making policy based on good, real data. So I just wanted to make that statement. And I did have a couple of questions about, I know that we've asked for, I want to know if we kept our commitment around the tax incremental financing. Where's the audit? Who benefited from it, right? Where did displacement happen? Because again, from people who live here for a long time, we have not seen the promises kept. So I don't want to keep doing what we've always done, and because we'll get the same outcomes. The same is also true for housing. We're waiting for the inclusionary inclusionary housing piece, right? On developments, right? Where developers give us a couple of units that are supposed to be affordable. But if they're at 80, are we really fooling ourselves that that's affordable for anybody who's working for a living? So those are the questions that I still have. And I want to have time to have a deeper conversation, not just a 2-hour work session, and then be forced to vote on something.
So Commissioner, before we go to Commissioner Maps, I hope that what we are going to be talking about in the last slide around next steps addresses what you're talking about. And it's not an excuse, but we clearly have been stalled in the last 2 years on some of these structural conversations due to COVID. I know that they had started a couple of years ago on the future of both the housing services and economic development services. You're naming that conversation needs to be organized and had. And I think there's broad agreement among the leadership on that. So we will come back to that. Thank you for naming that. The audit and the other questions, I've asked staff to get back to us on that around your questions there. Commissioner Maps.
This is a question for Peter, the economist. You still there?
Confirming that we have a city economist. We do. Hi, Peter. Go ahead.
Hey, this is a totally unfair question, but and it's completely fine if you don't have an answer to it or if there is no answer to it. But Commissioner Hardesty's questions earlier about, or concerns, I probably would be a better way to put it, about opportunity zones, touched on a question that I've had. Do we know how? To briefly some background, as I understand opportunity zones, after investors can invest in real estate in Portland, and then after 10 years, you can sell and get a tax break. Let's put it that way. Is there a conventional wisdom about how the expiration of opportunity zones, or at least the sunsetting, will impact the real estate market? Are we expecting that to increase more volatility, drive prices down? Is it so far out it doesn't make a difference, or?
That's a great question. And part one of my answer is I need to look into this a little bit more, because when this happened a few years back, the discussion and the conventional wisdom may have changed since then. The thinking then was that basically the tax benefit of this 10 years down the road would be capitalized into the current price of the real estate asset, because that's how the financial models work. And so the long-term effect wasn't as strong as the short-term effect initially. But again, I would have to look into this more, and it's a great question.
Okay, not a rush question. I think we have some time before we hit that, but if you run across any new information on that, it's something I'm curious about and tracking. Thanks.
Commissioner, you just made Peter very happy with that question. It's great. All right, Commissioner Ryan, Mayor Wheeler, Commissioner Rubio, any follow-ups before I do the last couple slides here and we get into more discussion?
I can wait.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mayor, I can't see. I got to pan down. Did you? Okay. I think we're okay. All right. Next slide. Now, we've already started to touch on this as our planning group thought we would throughout, right? This is the real action of the work session, or the work of the work session, so to speak. We're going to put forward a framework for how we do this complex decision making with you and provide some value for council. And knowing that you already knew from previous budget sessions that the needs outweigh the resources, and sorry again for my money saving light, we want to leave you with a framework, and we want to make sure that we understand where you want to be on this spectrum. Next slide, please. So as I said at the beginning, there are a lot of plausible paths here. There's many different ways to think about returning resources and how an elected body of city council members would think about it. We're trying to make it understandable in terms of how to move forward and give us direction to work with you on scenarios that are viable. And we put forward what we think are several needs that are viable today. But as you can see on the left of the slide, and for folks with low vision or who are blind who can't see it, we have status quo budgeting on the far left. So status quo would mean no strategy, treats all returning tax increment financing resources in the same way as we do general fund. Needs will be prioritized every year in the annual budget process. So that's the far left. I'm going to be very clear throughout this. We do not recommend that. Right side, for those who can't see it or have low vision, would be to fully pre-allocate available resources, specific needs. It strikes me personally as that there's a lot of certainty that we probably don't have in a full pre-allocation, but that is one scenario that a city council or any elected body with purview over returning TIF could do. The middle, which is what we've heard from most of you individually, is that you're somewhere between the middle and the right. So you're somewhere between partially pre-allocate resources or hold some dollars as we figure out whether it's legal settlements or future models of service delivery, somewhere between partially allocate and fully pre-allocate. Again, we firmly believe as people that day-to-day run these services and that you depend on for this work, we believe you should have a strategy, that the city should have a strategy. If not, these resources come back and are subsumed in everything and all the pressures that we have day-to-day, and we're not planning for them for the future. We want to confirm that we are at least close from our individual conversations, that you're somewhere on the we should plan, and that we should bring you some scenarios to partially allocate resources and hedge against uncertainty in the future by holding some of the resources. Can we hear from council if we have been listening well to you and if we are close to the mark.
Could I go ahead and jump in?
Please, yeah, Mayor. And I saw Commissioner Hardesty nod and then Commissioner Mapps after. Go ahead, Mayor Wheeler.
Okay, great. I'm sorry if I jumped ahead of anybody. I'm on my phone at the moment. So I am in the middle. I do believe we should pre-allocate some of these returning TIF dollars. In particular, I do believe we need to look at economic development and housing as core services provided by the city. But at a later date, we also need more information on the strategy around economic development and housing. And I won't re-give the entire speech I gave the other day on rethinking the way we deliver services as part of our commitment to addressing future needs. But I think people know where I'm coming from on that. We don't necessarily just want to fund business as usual. We need to think about maximizing our reach and the bang for the buck. The second thing I want to point out is that if we don't discipline our approach to returning TIF resources, we run the risk of not ever being able to fund things like deferred capital maintenance or long-term needs around investing in infrastructure. And so I continue to be a strong supporter of Build Portland. Again, the early results showed what is possible and what kind of projects we can move and what kind of support we can get from the community to do it. So long story short, I don't think we should reserve all of it. And frankly, I don't think that's a practical solution because it assumes things about the future that we don't know to be true. On the other hand, simply letting it all come back as completely flexible general fund dollars, I think that would be a mistake because that tends to favor the crisis of the moment as opposed to long-term strategic thinking.
Thank you, Mayor. Commissioner Mapps.
Commissioner Hardesty had her hand up first.
Oh, apologies. Go ahead, Commissioner Hardesty. I didn't see that. Go ahead.
Thank you. I don't disagree with anything the mayor said, and he's right. The Build Portland has actually been the only influx of money to do lots of deferred maintenance projects that PDOT enjoys. Remember, we have a $4 billion maintenance backlog, and there's never been a plan to actually reduce that before Build Portland. I did not hear anything about our pension liability as one of the significant financial issues that are unknown as we move forward. So I noticed that wasn't part of this conversation. Director Kennard, is there a reason why we left that out this year?
Yes, thank you for the question, Commissioner. And I will see if CFO Kirby has anything to add after I speak. We both talked about it, and actually when we first started our conversation around this presentation, we were thinking about the PERS liability, but in notating the vast array of potential demands on this resource, we tried to be very, very focused on those issues that were most urgent amongst our major liabilities, which is the major maintenance backlog and the Portland Harbor. We do have some additional thoughts that we are developing around potential strategies to bring to council for the PERS liability. So we're still working on that, and we plan to come back to council with some thinking on that at a future time.
Thank you very much. And the one other piece that I found missing is around our legal liabilities. We tend to get sued a lot, and we don't lose often, but when we do, it costs us money. And if we don't anticipate that we're going to have those legal expenses, it traditionally comes off the general fund. So as we're planning for the future, I just want to make sure that we are listing all our long-term liabilities so that we are not in a place in the future where we've committed funds that we are forced to lay off staff in other bureaus because we did not plan appropriately. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Mapps.
Thank you. First, I want to say great presentation. I really appreciate everyone's work pulling this information together. Very thought-provocative. Provocative.
We're not done yet, Commissioner.
All right. Well, here, I'll make it quick. I clearly support pre-allocating dollars for the Portland Harbor and for real estate investments. I'm not really ready to make new investments in or make pre-investments in economic development and housing, partly because I think we have some work to do around what our future approaches to that are going to look like. So I'd like to have a clearer sense of what Prosper looks like in the future and how housing works in the future. I thought many of the ideas that Commissioner Hardesty put on the table for housing are certainly at least worthy of future or more consideration. And I'm also skeptical of making pre-investments in our current council priorities on things like community safety, houselessness, livability. You know, I can't tell you how many 911 calls we're going to have in 2024-25. I can't tell you how many homeless people are going to be on the streets in 2024-25. I don't know how much graffiti is going to be out there in 2024-25. And I don't know if in those years, those are going to be our top priorities. So I'd like to see us wait before we make investments in those areas. But otherwise, I'm in the middle.
Okay. Thanks, Commissioner. That helps. Commissioner Rubio.
In thinking about all this, I also am thinking about the form and function, and this is a time to kind of maybe revisit the form maybe that it takes. But I do believe that when I look at these areas, I'm thinking about community and services that community rely on. I'm thinking about employees as well in continuity so that community can receive the consistent service that it needs. So I think am in the middle where making some general support for the functions, big bucket functions that we need to continue while allowing us the ability to revisit form and how we shape it for moving into the future.
Thanks, Commissioner Rubio. Commissioner Ryan.
Yeah, I think there's a theme here. I think I'm in the middle too, but it's because I want to have a deeper conversation about finding out if there's consensus or where we're at in terms of what we see these two entities, what we see in terms of economic development and what we see as the benefits of that. I think that we make it really difficult for investors to invest in Portland and to build in Portland, period. And I would like to think that Prosper Portland could be a helpful engine to that because it has an economic development piece. And I see their purpose for being helpful to small businesses being more important today than ever. And so I think we just, for me, it's, I think of the big projects that we need to tackle, whether it's the Broadway Corridor District, whether it's where the ESCO properties are, whether it's OMSI and Lower Southeast and Open River, South waterfront. You know, what do these investments do so that we can dream big and build as we go forward? And I would like to think that Prosper Portland's a part of that equation. And right now, I feel like we're so in the weeds on the current business model, if you will, of each organization. So there's nothing wrong with that, but it's hard to be inspired about where we're going unless, as a team, we talk about what our values are in terms of those entities being an engine to help fuel that future development.
I think that's a really good segue to further conversation on the next slide. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Commissioner Ryan, because Council already beat us to it around particularly the second bullet. So the planning group is convinced that it's past time to really dig into what Council members are naming here. I appreciate what Commissioner Rubio said about certainty and stability for community partners and staff. These are big changes that could be considered. And again, like I said in my introductory comments, the 26th most populous city in the United States needs to have a clear strategy and vision here. So these conversations need to be organized and implemented, and we're going to have to follow up with you as a next step on how you as our council want to do that. We obviously can't do that without you in a very focused effort with project management, community input. There's lots to do there. I feel like that is a very common theme among all five of you, and please just confirm that I'm right, that you do want to have those conversations. The other possible sources of funding was injected in, and I think we predicted that, and the planning team did a great job. And then on the first bullet, we started to get at a lot of your shared priorities and some different priorities on pre-allocating some, but keeping some flexibility in the future. We'd like to hear more in the next few minutes around our hope would be to work with you on a budget note for June. There's a lot of planning and implementation work that would need to go into debt financing or funding any of these complex areas that we talked about. It's not an easy task for our teams. So as CAO and the budget leadership and the budget director, we would develop scenarios and work on them with all of you as a way to follow up from this session. But I think that, please correct myself and my colleagues if we're incorrect, but that's what we really want to discuss with you as next steps. And it seems like we're getting to that in the latter part of this session. So please just weigh in.
Yes.
Okay. Director Kennard, do you want to add to that and provide some clarity on my monologue there?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make it clear to the council is that what we would be doing is because we would not be allocating resources for the 22-23 fiscal year because there aren't any anticipated resources coming back that would be available without taking cuts in that year. What we talked about here is what we would do is establish a budget note. And the benefit of that is because we're not actually allocating dollars in the system is that council can wait until the very last phase of the budget, which is the adoption of the budget in June, to adopt that language that's in the budget note. And so that's why we would have that June deadline. So I just wanted to be sure the timing of this conversation was clear.
Thanks, Director. Go ahead, Commissioner Hardesty.
That raises a question for me. I don't think we're going to have a decision in 3 months about what percentage of the returning dollars are going to be ongoing for any programs. So I'm a little concerned that we would be rushing to make that decision by the final budget vote rather than taking the time to do it in the fall process. What's the necessity of actually making that decision in June versus making it later in the year?
Functionally, what you would be directing is you would be directing Peter to take a certain amount of funding out of the forecast, and you could be as specific or general about the proposed uses of that resource as possible. But functionally, be taking money out of the forecast, and you could, Commissioner, you could wait until the fall to do that. That is absolutely true because we developed the forecast. The first iteration of the forecast is in December, so that is another possibility. And then, as CAO Reinhardt said, the development of scenarios, we could provide you with a handful of different options that you could choose from or consider that would have varying levels of specificity or generality in the language for prescribing resources for certain things or sort of more generally holding money aside.
And do you see us having a work session or some vehicle for us to have a conversation before you give us scenarios to respond to?
Commissioner, we're always happy to come back and have a work session. We would want to make sure it's useful and that there's some level of agreement on directing us to do further work and that it's productive for the city. But yeah, of course we would do that. And it should be a public conversation at this level. Mayor Wheeler.
Yeah, Tom, thanks. I have a question. So I like the path ahead here. I'm just a little confused about the timing of it. So we are in the 21-22 fiscal year. We will be planning for the 22-23 fiscal year. There's no financial impact until the fiscal year after that. And so while I heard the answer about reserving it as part of the forecast, I'm curious as to why we are doing it. It seems to me that this would be part of the 23-24 fiscal year budget planning process, not 22-23. What am I not getting right here?
Go ahead, Director Kennard, and then I have a point on that as well. Go ahead.
You are absolutely correct, Mayor. It is not, we would not be planning to allocate these resources to any specific purpose potentially until the 24-25 fiscal year. The reasons to make a decision to set this funding aside earlier is that by taking it out of the forecast, it earmarks it, it sequesters the resource, and it does not become part of the available resource that everybody sees that is published as generally available. And so when Peter gives his forecast in December next year, he could potentially show that millions and millions of dollars are available for council to spend. And that is our forecast now. And then that would not take into account the fact that council has in their mind an idea how they want to spend a certain amount of that resource already. And so the idea is that if you want to set some of this aside, it would behoove us to do so before the forecast comes out, so it doesn't establish this public sense that we have more money available than what council really intends to put towards new or emerging items in the next budget process.
Okay, so let me see if I can parrot this back in a slightly different way. And I think I hear what you're saying. And what you're saying is, if we are going to exercise fiscal discipline, which is notoriously challenging to do, right? Because if there's a big pot of money, there'll be 1,000 different interests coming at that pot of money for immediate needs. So your objective here and your admonition to us is reserve the funds as early as possible in the interest of fiscal responsibility. Is that a fair rephrasing and parroting back of what you are saying?
That is, Mayor. If it is the priority of the council to ensure that these different items that we discussed today have some level of funding, I think it would be fiscally prudent to set the money aside for those purposes, either generally or specifically.
Okay. And I'm hearing two other things from my colleagues, which I share, and I just want to put it back on the record, which is that you've made a good case here, and this has been, I think, an excellent presentation. I still would like to hear more about the future of housing and economic development in particular. And obviously, we would be reserving or retaining some amount of flexibility for urgent needs, whether it's homelessness or public safety or whatever. But I'm still not completely clear on the future vision for either housing or economic development. And I know this isn't the right time or place for that conversation today, but I think it's important that conversation happen. And if you believe that we need to lock this down prior to June of this year, then I think it's pretty urgent that we have those conversations about what the future looks like.
Director Kennard, can I jump in? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Director Kennard, were you?
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Mayor, I think we should just be very clear about this. If the council, we would recommend that the council does set aside some dollars for economic development and housing to have the conversation. Here's why I'm saying that. If we don't do that, those entities within the city will have to very quickly move to contingency planning on programs and staff. They would only be a year out. So in terms of making decisions, the reason that we would want some direction by June, at least to start, even if that's just setting aside some dollars for a planning scenario and for a phased approach to this work, Prosper Portland and Housing would have to be making moves pretty quickly around continuing to ramp down staff in lieu of
so basically let me try this then, Tom, and I think I'm following you now, and I'm sorry I'm being somewhat dense on this, but I really want to make sure I understand. It sounds like the conversation will happen, but from a fiscal perspective, to make sure that there continues to be resources in the general categories of affordable housing and economic development. The scoping of this or the staging of this is that we put the dollars aside through a budget note to show an ongoing commitment to the concept of affordable housing and the concept of economic development, but that will then start the conversation that this council will have over the course of, it sounds like, about 2 years to chart what that future is. Is that accurate?
Mayor, that's accurate. We would also say Portland Harbor and deferred maintenance and the other pieces we presented. That council should make a decision around those key categories, even if you don't know exactly what a settlement number would be yet, or what you exactly want to do on a capital improvement plan. Correct. Your basic outline is correct.
Okay, that's helpful, and I appreciate your playing along with me on that. That's very helpful, and I appreciate it.
Over to Commissioner Maps.
The mayor, I agree with a lot of what the mayor said. And I also understand Commissioner Hardesty's concerns about why we need to, or is this the right time to set aside these dollars? I can tell you I think as part of this year's budget process, I can commit to making investments in the Portland Harbor Fund. I think that is just a no-brainer. Our infrastructure needs are so great. Doing some sort of, even if we're not sure what our upper limit is, at least making a short-term investment so Peabot and Parks can begin to have some planning about what happens next. I would be surprised if by the time we got to the end of this budget process, I had a clear vision and was really ready to commit on economic development and housing. I just think those are big, thorny issues. Maybe I could be wrong, and we got talented people here. But that's where I'm at. I do feel like there's just a lot of work, a lot of mutual thinking that needs to happen on housing and economic development. I think there's really not a whole lot of thinking left to be done on Portland Harbor and our need to make investments in infrastructure.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Ryan.
Thank all of you for continuing to answer these questions. Would you all agree that there's a lot of balls in the air in this conversation? All right, thanks. Because that's why it makes your head hurt in a good way, and we obviously should spend more time on this topic. So when you had the chart up earlier about, I think it was like status quo or do this, it's basically like do nothing, do something, really go for it. The disconnect I'm having is the tougher conversation about what our goals are for each of the areas. And what are those goals for the next 10 years? So I think everyone wants to clean up the river. And that makes sense on every level you can think about. I think that where we'd have some different opinions perhaps is we might even get to the same opinion on how much supply of housing we need to construct.
Right.
And then how is this conversation connected to achieving that goal? Very important point to figure out. And then when we're looking at infrastructure, which we had a great presentation about that, and everyone should be worried. And whether you think about, a big one coming, boy, we're screwed. So it's like, how can we elevate that? And how do we connect the dots to those goals? And I recall the methodology to get there seemed like it was 2040. Is that where we were headed? Okay. So I'm not saying that anyone did anything wrong. I'm just saying there's a lot of balls in the air. And sometimes I want some 3D graphic that would help me understand this better. And watching it in an IMAX theater, I mean, I don't know what to do here, but it's like, it's complicated on sorting through all of these.
Yes.
The city needs a strong economic quasi-agency, I believe. I just want to have the tough conversations about what does that look like and how will it serve those who want to invest in Portland, those who want to live here, those who want to be, we've always been a city that's over the years that was a great gathering place of creative class, and we want to know where they're going to live. And we've always had that question. And it used to be we had a lot of, funky, cheaper units and what I always called mob pop, landlords. And so we're getting into housing supply questions on a bigger macro level in this conversation. And I can't dismiss that from the thinking at this moment. And so I guess I ask us how we can have a session where we do some tough scenario planning in each area and then come back to figure out what's our gap in each one. Like what would be based on the aspirational goals of the council, then what's the methodology increment to get there in over 20 years? And what's that path look like? And how does the engine of Prosper Portland provide those services? How does the engine of the Housing Bureau provide those services? But we have a major supply challenge, and we have a lot of people who don't want to build here. And we've been in denial about that for some time. And so I'm going to keep saying that, even if it's not popular, because it's important that we make sure that this is going to be a private and public partnership, or we're never going to get out of the ditch that we're in. And so I'm clear about that too. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner. Before we go to Commissioner Hardesty, I think you're naming what we were struggling with in the planning, which is there are policy questions, there are finance and budget questions, there are technical questions. You're correct. We have to figure that out, how they're all overlapping. I hear what people are saying around we may not be ready for June, but if we're not ready for June, we better have a clear path towards the fall. And that this has been a really healthy conversation we should have more of on these subjects, because it's tying together a number of work sessions, which I think Commissioner Ryan, you and Commissioner Hardesty and Commissioner Maps and Commissioner Rubio have all mentioned here. Over to Commissioner Hardesty.
And you've made clear that we're on a cliff, so we get the whole cliff part, and we do need to take action. So thanks. Commissioner Hardesty.
Yeah, Commissioner Ryan, I'm sorry. My facial expression is about, we've known this TIF cliff has been coming since its inception. And so I just want to, and I've been asking since I showed up in 2019 about the plan. And even today, the only plan I've heard is around general fund dollars. I've heard no plan about how we're going to operate differently. And that really troubles me, because no one should be surprised that the TIF cliff has arrived, because we knew it for over a decade. What I am surprised at is that there's been no planning either by the Housing Bureau or Prosper that is not solely dependent on the general fund, which was why I insisted that the budget note have the finance and budget office and the economists be the ones that present this, right? So, and so it is a crisis, but it's not a crisis that we didn't know was coming. It wasn't one that we should not have planned for, and had a transition that would have been important. I agree with Commissioner Maps. I'm ready to set aside money for the harbor cleanup. We will be required to. We don't have a choice. That has to happen. I'm ready to set money aside for our deferred maintenance. It's appalling, some of the places we force our workers to work in. But I am not ready because, again, since 2019, I've been looking for a plan, and I am not ready to be guilted into a decision by June when we have not had the deeper conversation that is absolutely critical. I want to hear from Prosper what's going to be different in this unique economic development situation. When Commissioner Ryan says developers don't want to invest here, $4 billion have been invested here into creating these very beautiful office buildings and apartment buildings that, again, Portlanders cannot afford to live in or lease. And again, with urban renewal / incremental tax financing, the promises that have been made for those programs have never been realized. And without an audit, without some analysis about what's going to be different and unique in this new reiteration, I just feel like what you're going to be asking us to do is going to be status quo, and it is going to be no new thinking and no new vision about the unique nature of where we are. We got a lot of investors. They poured $4 billion in the last 2 years. What we don't have is investors that are actually working to protect workers in the city of Portland, right, and making sure they can thrive in this community. And I would hope that the city would be thinking if we're doing economic development, that it would be actually helping Portlanders rather than outside investors. So we're at a critical place here in the city of Portland. And again, in a couple of short years, workers will not be able to live here. And if we do what we've always done, we will get the results we've always gotten. Thank you.
Thanks for the comments, Commissioner. I know Director Branham is ready to respond. Director Branham.
Thank you, Tom. So I just want to, Commissioner Hardesty, I want to make sure that, because you and I have had a chance to have this conversation in public, so I wanted to be able to respond in this way and just note that we did have a plan. Prosper Portland did put forward a plan, and we brought forward the financial sustainability plan to City Council in 2018. And at that time, we had about $400 million. And the $400 million, we were intending to invest it in a way that really balanced public benefits and returns to help us make sure that we were in line with other agencies and have a mixture of earned income and resources. And unfortunately, COVID happened right in 2020 as we were starting to see up to $9 million annually in new revenue from that, and really sort of took out our legs from under us. And not only has had a really significant financial impact in the pandemic, but is also delaying significantly some of the major real estate projects and partnerships that we're going to have community benefits, but also have financial returns. And so happy to talk more about that. But I just want to be really transparent that we have known this is happening, and we put forward our new strategic plan in 2015. And so we followed up with the business plan that accompanied that. COVID upended everything, and we've been really hard at work delivering on the crisis at hand and responding to the crisis at hand. But we hear and will be very excited to have conversations with council about what the future will look like. And we'll make sure as we move forward with the consultants for the economic development strategy that some of their first engagement is directly with each of you so that they can hear your priorities directly.
Thanks, Director Branham. So council, I promised that I'd check in with you. We thought we'd be done a little before 3. I think this conversation is fantastic and I want to continue it, but I want to check in and get your permission to continue for 15 more minutes or so. Can I get some head nods or some head no ways or okay. So I've also lost, just to be honest, I've also lost the queue here. I'm not sure if Mayor Wheeler's next or Commissioner Maps is next or Commissioner Ruby. Can someone help me here? Who's next?
I left my hand up by accident, Tom.
Okay.
Go for
it. Commissioner Maps.
Thank you. Question for Peter, the economist. I'm looking at your budget forecast from December 2021. In that you have $23.6 million in set aside resources. I assume that's kind of TIF. Today we're talking about 19.5 million. So there's like a 4 million difference. What's that about?
Thank you, Commissioner. Great question. That is DCTU and PPA. Now that they're approved, they have been rolled into the forecast.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Rubio.
I just was curious if it's appropriate time. I would love to hear from the community budget advisors about this.
I'll put them on the spot. Good.
Mayor, you're not muted.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. Yeah, remember to be on mute if you're not speaking, please.
Now am I muted? No.
No. Now you are. Community budget advisors. Apologies that I haven't asked you to jump in earlier. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah. Hey, good afternoon. Really excited to be part of this. Once again, new to this process. Incredible presentations, incredible robust discussion from our elected leaders that with such critical decisions in front of the city. I would add, and it's not so much a question, is really more of an anecdote or a comment, right? Be upfront, any conflict of interest. My organization does have a contract with Prosper Portland, has for 5 years. But it's a small contract. And we got that contract about right at the time that the organization really began to grow. And it was really a key component of that growth. It really afforded an opportunity for a community serving organization, a culturally specific community serving organization to have that opportunity for growth, along with strategy and planning and good staffing. And I think we've developed a strong relationship there as we've gone through our process for the past 5 years. And I would even just want to take a moment to recognize some elements of that and how it has such a ripple effect, not only in the growth of the organization that I represent, but their Inclusive Business Resource Network has served as a template of sorts for our own technical assistance program statewide. And I would really love to see economic development strategy continue to prioritize communities of color, small businesses, underserved, marginalized communities at the forefront in their small business development. So I would just add that comment more as an anecdote as we think about these large processes and priorities, that we remind that there are individual small things that have happened that have been catalysts to change for communities. So thank you.
Thanks, James. Great to have you with us. I'm sorry, I think we have Kevin on. I see Show as well. Hi, Kevin.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I'm just kind of learning about this conversation, so it's a lot to take in. So I don't really have lots of opinion, but I am thinking in terms of just kind of equity for, as Commissioner Hardesty said, for the locals and people who work here and live here, and how they can kind of stay in Portland. I've been here almost 25 years. Oh my God. And, I was blessed enough or lucky enough, I purchased my home years ago, and, I saw all the increase and all that stuff, but people that are coming here now are just starting off, they're not in the position I am. And that's just from timing. Also, just from, say, contracts with the city, state, or whatever. I've spent the last decade plus working in not-for-profits in Portland. And just kind of the contracts we've had with the city, the county, and the state, those historically, I'm sure the market has changed really a lot lately, because I keep getting calls for new jobs, but they have historically paid really, really kind of low for a lot of work that people were doing. So those are kind of the two things out of this whole, and it's definitely deeper than that conversation, that kind of stand out in my mind. So
thanks, Kevin.
And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks to Commissioner Rubio for reminding me to ask our budget advisors. Any other questions, comments from our advisors? This has been a fun but challenging one to monitor all the interest in this. Thanks for all the engagement. Oh, go ahead, Show. Go ahead.
No comment.
Okay. Am I missing any community budget advisors?
Show, that's the smartest thing I've heard anybody say today, and maybe so far all week.
Tom, I just want to thank our budget committee. This is like a very dense subject, and it is really impressive to see how you're leaning forward to absorb this information. I have to tell you, I've been reviewing this information for a decade, and it's still really dense information. So I just want you to know, it just because you don't think you know it all right at the moment, don't feel bad, because none of us do, right? It is a long process to get some understanding, some basic understanding of how this stuff works.
Absolutely. So council, we are at 3:13. I'm going to take the risk of trying to sum up where we're at and what I think you are telling us that you expect from us going forward. Clearly, there's a desire for more conversations on the future of economic development and housing in the city. We expected this. We will work to facilitate. We want to be clear with you. It's going to take some work of you and your offices and some commitment around all the different options, including how to provide some certainty and stability to the community on these services as well. So I'm hearing that very loud and clear. We will also commit to providing implementation options towards what we think we heard from you around Portland Harbor, some level of commitment to deferred capital maintenance. And we also heard that while you may not be ready in June, you want a timeline if we don't complete a budget note in June. You want some commitment in this budget process, and it could be the form of a budget note towards the fall. You don't want us to drop off and wait another year and go into our own individual conversation. So I know Director Kennard and CFO Kirby and I will help with that. I know all the different bureaus involved will do everything we can to provide some clarity on options, but it sounds like you are appropriately skeptical and realistic about June and think we might need a two-step, so to speak, on the process. Director Kennard, CFO Kirby, did I miss anything on that? It sounds like that's what we're hearing from our city council.
I think that sounds great. And I just want to reiterate what I put in the chat. This was precisely the conversation we were hoping to have. I know it was a little uncomfortable, but we did not expect anyone to be able to get to that final sort of allocation decision today, because there was so much information, that like background foundational information, that we just had to get everybody on the same page around first. And so we did always see this as sort of like the initial level setting, and we are a little squeezed on timeline, but we'll get back to you with some options and we will move forward.
Council, any last questions or comments before we move to adjourn? I'm sorry that I didn't plan a break for you. I've learned more than I learn in each work session. I should have scheduled one anyway. We appreciate your time and commitment, and thanks to the many, many people from the bureaus that helped us present what is a very challenging presentation. Thank you. Mary, you want to send us off?
Yeah, good session, everybody. That was thorough and dense, and to be continued. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Director Kennard. Thank you, Chief Administrative Officer Reinhardt. We'll see you all in the funny papers. Take care.
Thank you.